but we can start to take self-responsibility. And just one act of that is profound.
Hmm. So let's jump into a little bit of like diagnosis or self-diagnosis. So how do you discern where there might be patterns of legacy trauma versus just your own personal life experience operating inside of you?
In some ways, if the trauma comes from childhood, it's almost always going to have an element of legacy trauma to it. Just by the nature of the fact that one of the strongest ways that legacy trauma gets transferred generation to generation is through our attachments, our attachment relationships with our primary caretakers. Were they loving? Were they attentive? Were they present? Were they checked out? Were they quick to anger? Were they punitive? Were they emotionally disconnected? And if they weren't able to be available for attachment with you, how did they get that way? Right? So it's a reflection of probably how they were raised and what were the beliefs about how we raised children at the time. If you don't mind, I might jump in with just a little bit of a personal story. I think it's impactful, and it really brings forward this theme. So some years ago, this was probably at least 15 years ago, I was teaching a class on attachment, on how do we heal family attachment. And for any of you that are listening to this word attachment and saying, what does that really mean? It's basically the way that a child is being cared for by primary caretakers, usually our parents, and whether we feel attuned to, loved, whether there's a source of bonding, whether there's someone that helps to regulate our emotions or care for our vulnerable emotions in those earliest phases of life, usually first 3 years or so. And as I'm teaching this course, I'm noticing that a lot is moving through my own system. I can tell that there's some personal material that's ripe and coming to the surface for me. And as I worked with that outside of the course in my own therapeutic process, I got in touch with the experience of how my father really couldn't be present with me in the way that I really needed him to be as an infant, young child, certainly into ages of my childhood that I could remember. Or his presence with me was intermittent. It wasn't reliable. It wasn't consistent. And I so happened, this is at a time when my grandparents were still living, so I can again kind of go back in time, and now I'm thinking, well, this must have been well before 15 years ago, because they haven't been around for a while. But I had an opportunity to talk to my grandparents about my experience, and I had an open relationship with them where we could talk about such things. And my grandparents did something that was pretty life transformational for me. They offered me an apology. They said that when my father was born in 1941, my grandfather was a pediatrician. The kind of the rules, in a sense, the guidelines of how we raised children in 1941 was to not spoil the child. We don't touch them too much. We don't pick them up. We don't coddle. We don't cuddle. And so what my grandparents said to me was, we didn't touch your father. We didn't touch him other than to move him from the crib to the high chair to the tram, and they said that they regretted that because as pediatrics evolved and as our culture evolved, we moved more towards an understanding of the deep importance of attachment. And they really shared a deep regret because they could see later in life that their lack of touch and warmth toward him really impacted his sense of self and how he turned toward me, how he was able to be present or not present with me.